pay no attention to this because it's just going to be the repeat kind of the other side. But as we look at these styles represented in art, we really want to sort of take them apart based on this general information that I've sort of given you before. Okay, so we need to talk quickly about Baroque. Remember this idea of the irregular curl? The style of Baroque architecture is, you know, sort of the glory of God, but it still feels awkward and not, you know, again, heavy. If you notice, it feels like it's going to fall in on itself somehow, right? A lot of times the weight is distributed incorrectly. And we'll even see this in the clothes in some way. Even here, it feels like the roof and such is a little bit more heavy than what is supporting it down at the bottom. But we can see all sorts of examples of this overly ornate style that ultimately will get resolved once we get to the next couple periods. Now, this is a beautiful Baroque building. I think this is in the Netherlands. But do you notice how it's like, it's just a little bit Guga, as I call it, in the costume world. It looks like they just hot glued a few too many things on it, right? Yeah, there's a lot of busyness, and it doesn't have necessarily the harmony that we're going to see. But when you look back on it historically, you sort of see the harmony in the interior, I guess you could say, of it all. Here's a beauty. This is like the Baroque entryway of all Baroque entryways. Like literally, it looks like those things that have been in the ocean for a long time, you know, and just barnacles and seashells, anything that can get hot glued on it can. And architecturally, see this sort of pediment detail here? That's very early Baroque. It's sort of split arch that has the rounds in it. And here we can see inside of a church. I mean, but look at the scale too. It's just over the top in every way possible. I mean, these are people. This is the interior. Okay, so here's the word, déshabillé. Déshabillé. It is a state of undress. It is made popular in the Baroque. We're going to see how it influences not just daily clothes, but then sort of this idea of clothing in other periods. And we're going to talk about it specifically when we get to Versailles as a big idea, specifically Louis XV. Okay, so I throw this in here. These are beautiful sort of silhouette ideas that have been created by this Russian website, Bloshka. But you can see what's super nice. You might remember that image specifically from one of the lectures. But you can see how it sort of transitions. It's like every year something falls off, something changes, to the point where everything is different in 40 years, right? They look like they have no relation. And I always say to everybody, keep it in your mind that people don't wake up on the eve of 1620 and say, we're the Cavalier, you know, and all the pumpkin breeches disappear and we're in, you know, slopsland. It takes time for things to move. But you can see all the things we talked about, the rabat collars, we can see the higher waistedness of the doublets, we can see the gauntlets, we can see how the trousers kind of are more slop-like. Yes?
Do you find that like more public style switches as royalty? Did the royalty change their dress styles and then the people would kind of follow that?
Always, almost always. But here we are seeing some reflection on the poor, right? Or the middle and lower classes, because they're not wearing these things, right? They are wearing sort of more boxy, easier cut things that are probably already ripped because they're old. We're going to see them take on some of those ideas. That's what makes it so interesting and so complex, because the language, especially now, has always been, you know, let's look at portraiture and let's look at the royalty. But now we're going to even see our artists delve into the normal human, and we're going to see how those people adapt and sort of move through. So here's like the prime example, I would say, of a Cavalier gentleman. So we can see the doublet, In this case, with a very deep basque front, but do you notice how it still feels very high in the waist? Notice that the skirt, the peplum, are actually made up of tabs that in that lecture, in the terms we call peccadilles. Why? Because they're much more agile, right? I can move around in them. And if you see the sword, where's the sword? There's the sword right there, right? You can imagine how it wouldn't cover the sword. It would open up so we could still grab our sword. Here we can see a baldric, which is worn backwards over to the left side. How did I screw that up? Over to the left side, yes, the opposite side, because they are on this hand, or in truth, he may have switched the sword. So it would have been in the painting because he might have liked this side of his face better. You never know these things. But we could see how that would hold up that sword belt. We could see a slop breech or a fuller breech. They're not, pumpkin breeches like we saw before. Then we can see, as we're working down, regular hose, right? But then we see the boot, the bucket boot or the jack boot. And imagine, these are like thigh-high boots, right? Well, what have they done to make it look a little bit more casual? Like, oh, I've been riding on my horse, I've been doing all this stuff. They're sort of slouching down, looking a little sort of haphazard. And what I love is notice how it like falls down, but then it kind of falls back up again, It has a casualness to it, but it is still very formal in a lot of ways. We can see the lining of the boot there. Sometimes that'll change color. And then we see the boot here itself. And notice that it has that little butterfly shape on the front. That is the spatterdash. And then notice in the back, can you see the spur? Right? Again, he's not going anywhere. But it's giving kind of the ambiance of I could do anything. Back up at the neck, we can see how high that rabat collar is. We can see that it's starched, but lots of lace on it. Then we can see the shoulder wing. And then moving down to the sleeve, you can see that there's kind of a fullness at the top, made with panes, right? Individual strips. And notice how those come down to a fitted sleeve. Now, he's wearing his gloves, but you can see these gauntlet gloves are easily sliding, probably if you took them off, a perfect gauntlet underneath. Now, also notice up here, longer hair becomes popular. We can also see facial styles. This sort of conglomeration we call a Van Dyke because Van Dyke was very popular at this time as an artist, but you can see the mustache, the sort of goatee beard that was very popular. Now, with the hair, one of the challenges is that fashionable long hair isn't easy. How many ladies have cut off their hair, or gentlemen, and then want to grow it out again? How long does it take? Forever, right? So I often speak ill of my gender, so forgive me for saying that. But do you think guys would be as patient? No. So what are they going to throw on their heads?
Wigs.
Yeah, wigs. So much easier. Throw it on just like a hat. And so this culture of wigs for men becomes very popular at this time, partially because of the length. We're going to see some people, like in the case of the king here, he is probably wearing a wig, but it would eventually grow out. But the idea of wigs starts to normalize in society and will play out in many different ways going forward. Last thing I want to show is notice how also ribbons are very popular. Gallants, as they're listed in the terms, and they look like things could tie together. Now we're going to get to a slide so that you can understand a little bit more about their use, but we will often see them either on the waistline, on the sleeve head, or around the breeches. So anytime we see those ribbons, we call them gallants. Very famous Franz Hall's Laughing Cavalier. Now, we don't see much in this, and even if you're at it, what looks photographic here is actually perfect, what I call paint splotches. Like, it's just magic. It just is like this, and this is what happens. But first thing, do you notice how the collar looks like a falling band collar, but it's really just an unstarched ruff? but notice how it's being worn in the same manner on that triangular sort of softness. Notice the sleeve broken down into panes. Notice that just like I might do, the cuff of the doublet has been flipped back, allowing us to see the lining, allowing us to see more of the shirt cuff. But then notice all these beautiful buttons up that as well. So we get a sense of movement, of activity in this that I think is super interesting. And then over this is a certain wrap. And then notice the hat, super broad, but cocked to the side and flipped up so it won't get in our way when we're fighting. Here we can see another gentleman. Notice that his rabat collar or his falling band collar is very different, much more plain. But you can see how it sort of, these details kind of personify the character of the person, right? This person does not feel extravagant, looks very put together, looks a bit maybe conservative, but we can see beautifully illustrated all of those darts in there. So think of how fine that linen must be to be able to see through it, the darts, right? But we can see an overcloak. Look at all the buttons, button palooza. And then notice the doublet itself, very high-waisted, little gallant right there. I love that, that little pink bow right at the belly buttons. But notice the buttons that run all the way down the front of it. And then notice that this gives a little bit of spread at the shoulders. And then that perfect hat, right? Tipped up at one side, a gorgeous red feather. Nothing says sort of Cavalier more. Oh, and then we see a baldric straight across, right? Now here we see a much more casual. See how this feels a little bit more déshabillé? It's like, oh, I just rolled out of a bin somewhere. I don't know. And I mean, it still looks formal, and but it just feels a little bit more soft. Even notice his rabat collar just feels a little rumpled. Feels like, you know, he just got out of a fight maybe, or he just is too busy to deal with starching it. And we can also see in here with the cloak, you know, those sort of the sort of wings and the sleeves. We can see the arm of the doublet coming through it. And, you know, black still tends to be what I call the color of Spain in Italy. So a lot of times when you see just black, especially on men, it tends to feel Spanish or Italian. And if you could see, you'd notice that there are tons of little buttons running all the way down over this cloak. But so here's that rabat collar, a real one. And you can see how triangular that is created. And then we can see the lace work on it. So this is from like 2017 on a bad camera that just about was ready to run out when I was in London. So that's why it's a little blurry. But you can see how shaped and how formed that is, and how the linen and the lace integrate together to create some form of structure. You can imagine how, if you starch that, how it would create that sort of triangular shape. So see, it can get a little silly too. Notice the proportions are just all a little off. The waistline feels a little too high. The trousers feel a little too low, right? But we see a great amount of experimentation. What I love about this silhouette illustration is notice this diamond shape that's kind of created from the chin to the shoulder and then down to the basque front. There's almost this great diamond shape happening right here that I think is very interesting. You know, because we tend to see, again, clothes moving through the body naturally. But now we're really getting into, oh, how can we play around with it? And notice that the jacket, the doublet, is slashed all the way to that kind of higher waistline. So it almost looks like he's wearing a corselet of some sort, right? Or a thick belt, but that's really the whole doublet. It's just cut into strips like panes. Notice the sleeves being, you know, very full and paned, how they're open up. And you can imagine, you can see it right here with his hand on his hip, how those panes would open up and show the kanika underneath. We can see the tab skirts a little bit long, you know, almost the same proportions we see here, but these sort of trapezoidal things, they look like they're tied on. Then we have these very long, in this case, Venetians, remember, full at the top, narrow down to the knee. But then it's all about the boots, right? Because it starts you up here and you're like, okay. And then you're like, wowza. So what we're seeing here is that these boots, which would go over the knee, are lined in red. And then the hose are folded over that red lining. So that's the boot hose. And again, see, hot glue some lace on that, why not? Then we see this gorgeous red lining, which draws your eye to it. Then coming down, we can see the spatterdash, we can see the spur, but then there's one other thing we can see here. Do you notice that it has a higher heel? I like to think of the boot heels in this period sort of being like fry boots, if you've ever worn a fry boot before. It's a little blocky, but this is where we start to see heels. We start to see the elevation of heels in men. We're going to see it sort of significantly there, while women's heels will start building up, and then we'll see men's shoes drop, and then men's shoes just kind of stay. Okay? But proportions are wacky and they're fun. Awkward hair. We've all been there, right? That awkward growing out phase. My roommate Charlotte just finished chemo about 6 months ago. So she obviously lost all her hair, and every day her hair's long, a little bit longer than mine, but she's like, I hate my hair. I'm like, you have hair? You have hair, but it's that like, ooh, when is it ever gonna look good? You know, one day he woke up and he's like, but not today. Here we see another, look at this. I just love this for a couple reasons. First of all, do you notice all these little red stripes in there? So those are actually panes, but they're lined with red. So imagine when you moved, how it would catch your eye, right? But super embroidered, super gorgeous. You can see here, these are showing the kamika, but some of these, you know, open up to red, and then here on the trouser. Then when we get down, you can see the bucket boot or the jack boot. You can see the brown lining. Then you can see the boot hose on top of that. You can see that he has a peplum, right? Not peccadillos, but a peplum, because it's a solid skirting, much like this one. We can see the beautiful rabat collar with this sort of lace on it. And then we can see the baldric as well. Notice that it's going this way and there's the sword again. So that one's right. He's also has a walking stick, still his gloves with the great gauntlets. And then look at that hat, that broad brimmed hat. Beautiful. Stylized, fabulous. So here's a real thing, and we will get into some real existing things. Obviously, you know, as you go along, you get more and more and more, but right now we're still somewhat limited to what exists. But here's a beautiful example of a Cavalier outfit in existence from the V&A. Notice how large that collar is, that falling band or that rabat collar. I mean, it's really creating a total triangle from right under the jaw, right to the shoulders. And then notice how high-waisted that doublet is. And in this case, with just a traditional skirting. Venetians, a little sloppy, but still pretty Venetian-like. And then the boots with the boot hose folded over. And this is what's nice when you can start to see real things, whether they're here or there, is we lose some of the artistic emphasis of things, which sort of throw our mind a little bit. We can see the sword, we can see the baldric, we can see the hat flipped up on one side. Fabulous. I say fabulous in this period because you know they think they're fabulous. They just look great. Now, as the period moves along, even though the waists are going to get a little higher, we are going to we're going to start to whittle away some of the excessiveness of it as we move into the Commonwealth, as we move into the Restoration. So we'll start to see some of the details move away and much more of a sort of rectangular figure. But what's nice about this is these things do live together in harmony. So when you're designing or when you're thinking about these periods, you have a lot to pull from. you know, because some people are wearing the much more pale, pared down version. Some people are wearing a much more expressive version. It's really great. I've always wanted to do Cyrano de Bergerac, one of my favorite plays of all time, because it, you know, it hits right in the middle of this Cavalier. And here we can see a bunch of Cavalier at a bar, right? So you kind of ask yourself, you know, this is like, are they casual or are they super fancy? Who can say? Well, I'm going to tell you they're probably much more super fancy for a couple of reasons. First of all, do you notice gallants everywhere? If I can hot glue a ribbon on it, I will. But then also notice that as opposed to boots, we see more of the shoes, right? And you notice that heel on it? That's not an action heel, people, right? Right, people? You look at that and you say, that's a moderate heel that one might wear to a nice job interview, right? It's not going out in the mud and sword fighting. But notice how there is a casualness to it. Those cuts sort of, you know, the slashing sort of feels active, like their clothes have been cut in combat. And then notice they're wearing these really broad hats. But we can see a rabat collar here, a rabat collar here, a soft ruff here. I think this is just a falling band, you know, no lace on it. So we can see variety, a great variety in the styles that are happening. Again, weird proportions, but people experimenting with it. Again, not great hair. It's okay. It's kind of like that 1987 perm. Yeah, very Tony Home perm. But the proportions are a little off. But it's these things are important too for us to show that people are experimenting. And in some cases, we'll see predominant silhouettes, but people are making stuff up too. But what's really great here, you can see that he's trying on different rabats. He hated this one. He threw it on the ground. We could see his kamika underneath there. You can see it's open, his sleeve, his gauntlet cuff there. Very, very long trousers. And then his boots, you know, folded up and then folded down and then folded back up again. We can see huge sort of spatter dashes on the front. So playing with proportion, having fun. Yet another one. If you notice really carefully, you can see that the waistline is almost at a ridiculous level. I mean, it's basically, yeah, I mean, it's we're almost at the Regency here. But what this does is we start to move from this period in the Cavalier that we then just forget about a waistline altogether. And you notice how this kind of has a trapezoidal feel to it? Like we might call it a swing coat, I guess, or something, but you notice how it has no waist? We're going to start to understand men's clothes in a very different way because of this, where it's sort of triangular from shoulder all the way down. A lot of detail going on here, right? With all these sort of fake buttons and buttonholes and openings. And then we can see the jack boots. We can see the spatter dashes, the hat. Look at the hair. Come on. Fabulous, Mr. Fabulous Hair. Another weird, disproportionate sort of silhouette, but it gives you a sense. Now, here's another thing that's kind of important. Do you notice down here on the shoes, now we can really see the heel? So this idea of the red heel is a very popular style that starts to become prevalent in this period that we traditionally will call a Louis heel. Louis heel actually can be two types of things. It can either be the red heel or it can be a shape of a heel. Sometimes people call them spool heels, but why would they paint that heel red? Exactly. So that you're looking at the heel. How many people know of a company that does something very similar today? Who is it? It's okay. Louis Vuitton, correct. Christian Louis Vuitton. You know, paints the soles red. What does that become? Status. Just status. Does it help the shoe? No. But it just draws your eyes. You go, ooh. Yeah, a little pop of red. So we can see how that silhouette plays out. And what's really nice is if we look at this young girl that's right there to the side, they're wearing a style that I would consider to be a mainstream Cavalier woman style. The woman here mostly covered up by this very awkward child. I have to tell you, those of you who've taken first semester with me know, I'm always fascinated by awkward children and freakish animals in paintings. So I try not to focus on them, but how can you not, right? Yeah, just like Bridget. And you know that they're swaddled, which people do today, but it literally, I don't know, it looks like some sort of, I don't know, zucchini or something wrapped up in things. Here we can see some young people. And what's kind of swell about this as well is you can see some variation in it. The young boy in blue is wearing a rabat collar. We see the softer, non-starched ruff. We see slashing. We see the higher waistlines. We see gallants everywhere. We see the buttons down the side. And then we can see beautifully the shoes, which look kind of like a Mary Jane almost, but they have that tongue, and that tongue is going to be really important as we go along. Notice the gauntlet cuff. There's just a wealth of fashion information from paintings in this period. This is just a really close-up image of that rabat collar, but I also want you to notice this sort of jacket. Now, this is the jacket that I call the cassock. The idea of the cassock is it was a T-shaped garment that had buttons that ran down the front, the sides, and down the sleeves. And what made it important was that you could go through and you can unbutton all of them and you have a blanket. You could button the sleeves to the side and you have a cape. Or you could button the sleeves down. So see how this one's done like a cape and how this one is done more like a sleeve? Right? So it could be a jacket, it could be a cape, it could be a blanket, it could be a hat, it could be a brooch, it could be a pterodactyl. We don't know exactly what it needs to be, but it's the epitome of a perfect garment. And it's very rare to find. There are only 2 or 3 of these actually in existence to help us understand it, but we see them hidden in paintings all the time. We're going to see them hidden in a few other paintings. But the cassock, the perfect garment we can see here, see those buttons and those buttonholes? Imagine, again, you don't have machines to do this. This is all by hand. Look at all those buttonholes. But you can see that buttons and buttonholes become status as well. So using buttons all over yourself certainly informs us. So if you remember that person who had them all over the trousers, it's just become status. Gross. We're just going to keep going. Okay, so I love this illustration. Those of you in first semester will remember this, but I found this, I didn't find it. I came across it at RISD, this illustration. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I was like, wait a minute. This answers so many questions about my life and costume history, because we can see all of these people fighting, and in doing so, it allows us to see all the pieces informally presented. And I love this. And can you see that they're like ties everywhere? We can see ties on the sleeves. Look at him. He's just like, whatever. This is totally déshabillé. But these clothes, when we look at them closer, I mean, there's look at this, kind of cavalierish, right? Sort of all whittled down around the ankle. His breeches are unbuckled, they're not tight to his leg, but we could see different ways that they would close and tie on. One more of that. Yes. And we can see like the trouser, the belt for the sword underneath the doublet, but then because it's in a peccadillo sort of deal, it's sort of underneath one. And then we can see here how the gallants could tie the doublet to the breeches to keep it nice and formal, but you can understand how those would eventually just become decorative, right? Gallants, as we know them. So we can see little details in all sorts of stuff. It's really great. I love that illustration. Here we can see a gauntlet glove. And both times that I went to study in England, there were always these big glove exhibits. They would have whole walls of these gauntlet gloves. And these are more Elizabethan, because they really did look attached. It doesn't look like the gauntlets attached. And that's great, because what you would do is you would make a gauntlet and then attach it onto a glove and give it to somebody. But slowly, as we see with a lot of those gloves, they figure out how to do it. And this is where we kind of leave the end of the Cavalier in some ways. There's not a lot we can fully see here, but that idea of that rabat collar changes. Do you notice how it's sort of moved towards the front, right? There's that corner that would be out here. Now it's so soft that it's moving forward. And we can start to see some qualities in the clothes that they become much more conservative as they're going along. What's great is he has, it's hard to see, but a cassock over him. If we go to the next one, nope, sorry. These, we would look at this and we would say, oh, these are Puritans, right? This is what our image of Puritans, but these are very fashionable gentlemen of London. They're just in very conservative clothing. And so we can see our own sort of Victorian imagery of Puritans and what we would expect. How many people, did an oatmeal canister and then a paper towel collar, right? Come on, we all did it. No, embrace that. Come on, that's when we were creative. But these are very fashionable. How can we tell? The facial hair certainly helps us. The styling of the hair helps us. Notice that we see lots of gallants and buttons and bows. That can inform us a little bit as well. And then here, this is a little bit later, but here we see a poor man, a countryman, establishing some of the details that we might see, right? The softer ruff, the gallants, buttons, we'll see people sort of take on some of these things. How are we doing on time? Ooh, 15 minutes, come on, we gotta zoom. Okay, so here's Rubens. Notice the fleshiness of Rubens, the softness of the body. It's not that restricted. Notice the arms, notice the legs. We even get like what we say sometimes dimpliness in the knees and such. And what's great in some ways is the women's clothes are just silhouettes. We don't have as many pieces, but certainly important to remember Rubens as we look at it, because we see a lot more of like hands and wrists, right? Because our sleeves are 3/4 or halves, and we see much more of the neck and the décolletage. So beautiful. I love yellow. So we can see how it goes formally, and then it gets softer and softer and softer until we're more in the Cavalier world where it's all breaking down. So everything would start with a stay. And again, the stays we don't want to think of as tight lacing. We want to think about them moving the body into place. So, I put this in because there's that formal kind of Elizabethan world. And this is where we go. Do you feel how it's softer? The body is still covered in a lot of the same ways. And if you remember Elizabethan, I mean, if this was starched, it would be more like that ruff that surrounded Queen Elizabeth. But now it's hanging down. Notice the gauntlets are sort of soft as well. I call these gauntlets lettuce leaves. This is just David stuff, because it looks organic. It doesn't look rigid. It looks sort of soft and like it's plant matter. But notice the 3/4 sleeves, the full ness of the sleeve. Remember how I talked about satin and silk being really popular? Notice that there's very little decoration on this, that it's really the textile is telling the story, this gorgeous sort of yellow. And then remember, I mentioned rosettes in the terms. You can see this sash around with a rosette. It is pretty much natural waist, but that width of that sash kind of gives it a double-waistedness where it feels higher. And because this is sloping down, it makes the waist feel also higher. Can you see the triangle or the diamond in there kind of too? But do you notice how low the shoulders are as well? That's again because of the stay, because of those straps pushing the shoulders down to create triangularity. And do you notice the little bit of fleshiness right there? Notice the arm. There's stuff. We got stuff. We got meat. We're meaty people. We're going to see lots of paintings of her over and over again. Here we can see and this is a little bit later, but this is starting to get into déshabillé and such. But notice how that's really riding on the bone of the shoulder. It's not down here, right? It's not that like bad Scarlett O'Hara costume. It's really right on that bone. And again, another image of her, very similar, lettuce leaves. Notice the sort of rabat collar shawl detail. It very much mimics the man's collar, but very much unique unto itself. Yeah, again, same portrait, just different colors, but notice how simple it is. Now notice this gown may be an open gown. Those other ones look closed, it just looked like a solid skirt. But notice how this one looks like it could open up. There may be buttons or ties all the way around. Here's just a pretty simple silhouette of that, probably what it looked like. It just kind of looks like a puff, right? We can see the roundness of the sleeves here. We can see the fullness here. When I was doing some research a while back, I was doing some research on 1830s. And what I found was a lot of the images that I had were actually the same copied image over and over and over again from different magazines and different drawings. But if you notice this sleeve, it looks almost exactly like the sleeves right there. I mean, it's almost exactly the same placement. So probably that drawing was just stolen from there, because that's what happens sometimes. Boop, boop. One more, and one more. Awesome. Here's a perfect example of déshabillé. Do you notice how this feels more like a bathrobe over a negligee? Sometimes it's called negligee as well. But definitely something's going on here, right? Now, again, notice that it's not the King Richard's Fair, shoving your breasts up that you could serve cocktails on. But it's really more of décolletage, right? Chestiness. We notice that there is a little bit there, but it's not like they look like they're going to jump out at any moment. But the whole feeling, even though it is controlled, you can even get a sense of that shoulderness right there. It's to give the illusion of something much more sensual and much more undressed than it possibly may be. This is also déshabillé, right? It looks like a shift or a nightgown right through here, but we can obviously tell this isn't, I'm not going to bed. I've got pearls on, I've got earrings on. So this influence of déshabillé becomes really important. Even this, which is a simple gown, it sort of feels like these layers that are open up are sort of revealing a great deal more. But you can see it's like gown, it's a different gown. Oh, look, a different gown. The gown is in a different color. I love this one because it's definitely male inspired, right? There's kind of a gender switch in this with the man's hat, very clearly that rabat collar. Even notice that the bodice of this feels like a doublet, right? Almost no sort of feeling here, the shoulder wings. But then it's sort of, as it moves down, it moves into more feminine details, right? The 3/4 sleeve, the open gown, revealing the jupe or the cyclet underneath. And notice how fancy that is. Just really beautiful. I love how this looks. Everybody steals this for a show at one point in their lives. I've seen it on stage 100 times. We look at the little guy she's giving the letter to. Can you see the cassock? Mm-hmm. All the buttons. Really cool. Super weird, fancy people. But what's great about this is we can see all the buttons there. We can see, similar to this one, like there is a basque, but it's really the wasting on it. We can see sort of the rabat collar showing off the décolletage. You know what I mean. Anyway, we can see an open gown with the jupe underneath, experimenting with all the different layers. And then different regions are going to have slightly different styles. So notice how the pieces are there, but they're worn differently, right? So notice that the sort of opening of this gown is really on the corners, but then there's kind of this Bertha collar that is in the same place, you know, some sort of shawl that feels like it's much more tightly wrapped around. You can tell a lot about this person just by the way they're dressed, right? Much more formal, much more conservative. We can see the jupe down here, but then the skirt itself is brought up. Can you see this little strap that's right there? I just learned about these the other day. It was kind of cool. But those are little straps to sort of hoist up your skirt. And then, of course, we have to talk about Vermeer in 4 minutes. But Vermeer, one of the premier artists of this period, not only because of the light and shadow, but also painting real people alongside the wealthy. But the other thing that's super important here, my friends, notice the colors, right? If these colors are available in paint, they were probably available in dyes as well. We don't believe they're making it up too much. So you can see that there is an interesting silhouette that is similar, but can't quite be played out in the exact same way. So some details that feel very much the same, especially when we look at like the lace maker here, a very famous sort of portrait. We can see the gown with a kind of rabat collar in yellow, and then we can see that they're making lace because that would be very popular for young people to do. But and we'll skip over that beautiful bust. We got things to see. But when we look at sort of the middle classes and lower classes of women, you can see that gowns are useful, as useful, I should say. So we tend to focus on separates. Remember when we looked at those jackets before? We can understand how jacket bodices and skirts would probably be the easiest thing to deal with. But notice how the shawls are worn in that very rabat style that we saw in the women, either the very fancy women. So super interesting, I think. Another beautiful illustration. This one's called the Lace Maker. And we can see that jacket. And this is for truly like costume geeky of all costume geeks. Because the backs of these often dig in super deep. So the sleeves start like right here because that allowed the most movement. It's really kind of crazy, but anyway. But gorgeous colors. And again, things can go terribly wrong. terribly wrong. But can you see how they're playing with proportion? Oh, it's almost the minute that something gets high, we're going to make it long. And the minute that it comes up, it's going to go back down. And then again, different areas are going to have different ideas. So this is a bit more of a Belgian look, where we can see a little bit of the Elizabethan in there, but we can start to see some softening of those ideas. But remember the carburetor filters? I showed that one day. Here's a Spanish one. If your eye isn't right here, I don't know what you're looking at, but again, disproportionate, crazy. Another Spanish. But what's crazy is we see this, which, again, if you know anything what's coming up in 100 years, it's going to be similar to this. However, at this time, Spain was doing this. And it's going to totally find a way into our fashion. Okay? So with that said, any questions? I know I try to go through this because, again, it's so much more exciting when you're in the room and I can hear you and I see you looking at the slides. So it does help. I know we could do this online, but then you turn the thing on sleeping. But ultimately, that's how we'll go through these classes, by going through each of these slides, talking about them, pointing out the important parts. So when you see those terms, hopefully you're reconnected back to those, okay? Any questions? Because I think we still have 2 minutes. Yes! My dream did not come true. We needed 30. What sort of questions might you have about the Cavalier, about these silhouettes, about the things that we see? Oh, come on, it's just some light.
Well, a warning, maybe.
Well, I walked to the side of the room. What do you think I was doing?
I've seen that.
You think that's where, you know, I get my snacks? After I do a good lecture, a little snack pops out of the wall. I'm like,
That
You
would
a
be
hamster?
great, though.
yes, the Infantata. Yeah, there's another famous painting too of the Infantata. Much older. Huzzah.
How do you wear that?
Oh, we're gonna find out.
Oh, no.
Now
Are
again,
those the ones with the cages underneath?
yeah, so we're talking about a very specific person too, who has no job
Yeah.
but to be the princess, right? So that is always going to inform us, but we have to be careful of being like comparing what we wear to how other people look at it, because we adapt to whatever is given to us, whatever is told to us. I mean, think about all those things that you're like, oh, I can't do anything in this. And then eventually you figure it out and you're like, oh, okay, whatever. And we see that sort of applies to go through. Yeah.
Versions of these outfits, and you could just all take a class and just test them out. Oh my god, this is hard.
Well, that's, you know, sometimes we do that when we do a period show. I will teach a movement workshop, you know, that ties into it, because everything from, you know, kind of the beginning of time up through the middle of the 20th century, the clothes rule how we sit, how we stand, how we sort of connect with each other. When we get especially to the Victorian, the mid 19th century, there are a couple things I'm going to show you live in class, because it's really important. Because we look at them and we say, how do you survive? Well, they're not sitting in desks. They're not walking through doors like that. I mean, remember those Baroque worlds, you know, they're accommodating those things. But I do recommend, there are a lot right now, cosplayers and costumers who do replications of clothes from these periods and talk all about them. And it's so fascinating. Some are really good, some are not, but that's okay. So that's how you can do that. Okay? It's kind of more fun in class a little bit, isn't it? Just a little bit? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah,
How do you see the difference?
we have
What do you think
Some.
about the costume?
so
Your personal opinion.
So my personal opinion is, I think it's fabulous because they're doing what people in theater often do. It's just it's recorded and everybody can chime in on it. So I admire the extent of it, but they make one mistake, which is don't give me a year. If you say 1813, I'm going to measure everything to 1813. But I think it's just like Cinderella. Everybody's seen the Disney Cinderella, right? That has nothing to do with any period. I mean, it's more Dior and Charles James than anything else, but who cares, because it's so beautiful. And I'm waiting for Bridgerton to do this a little bit, but everything I've seen, I'm like, who cares? Who cares? Like, nobody's making you watch it, right? But especially, you know, costume historians are always a little like looking for the perfect thing, and many of us do have a list of like the perfect Regency thing, the perfect. Yeah. But again, you know, this is what people in theater do, is they take something and they kind of create something out of it. And that's what they were doing to kind of elevate the fantasy of it, because it's not real. It's just not real. So have fun with it. I have more issues with the men's clothes than anything else. No, because there's something, the Duke should look so much better than he does.
I mean,
I know. No. Let me put it this way. He should look so much better in his clothes
yes,
than he
correct.
does.
They could have gone off a little bit.
Yes. So anyway, have a great day. Have a great day. I got to get on to my next class, but thank you for putting up with all the technology and all the craziness. And I hope that you have a great day.